He walked into Courtroom 3 in handcuffs, just another homeless veteran, dismissed and forgotten. But what no one knew was that this man once saved lives under fire in Iraq. What unfolded next would shake the very walls of justice. If this is your first time here, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love powerful true stories that restore dignity and spark change, hit that like, subscribe, and follow. We bring you new episodes every day. Now, let's witness the incredible story of Sergeant Samuel Hawkins. And the day Anna came home, Courtroom 3 creaked open with a dry, brittle groan. A frail old man entered in silence, his hands cupped behind his back. Samuel Sam Hawkins, 70 years old, thin-framed, wearing a faded military jacket frayed at the cuffs, its dull olive green bleached by time, much like the years etched into his weathered face. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the Havenbrook courthouse, the deep lines on his face stood out even more sharply, each one a chapter of a life once poured out on the battlefield. "Please state your name," the female court clerk asked gently. He nodded, voice trembling but firm. "Samuel Hawkins, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." No one in that courtroom, not the young prosecutor adjusting his tie, not the officer who brought him in, not a single spectator seated in the gallery, could have predicted what was about to unfold. To them, he was just another homeless man charged with disturbing the peace. No one noticed the quiet, careful way he sat down at the defendant's table, as if afraid to wake the ghosts of wars past. Sam hunched his shoulders, perhaps to shield himself from the bitter winter cold, or maybe protect the scars of war, the ones etched in flesh and the ones buried deeper. A few whispers floated from the back rows. Another old drifter should be grateful he's not in a shelter. Sam didn't turn around, didn't respond. He'd heard it all before, at the bus stop, outside the church, even in the VA hospital lobby. Case 12B, the bailiff announced. The city of Havenbrook versus Samuel Hawkins for disorderly conduct, trespassing, and failure to comply with police orders. Sam rose slowly, his knees cracking in quiet protest. The oversized coat hung loosely on his worn frame. He once wore a sharp dress uniform. He once marched proudly down city streets to the sound of martial drums. But today, he had only a pair of worn-out boots and a dignity long forgotten by others. The young prosecutor, eyes flat and voice mechanical, began. "The defendant has been repeatedly warned against loitering near the exhaust vent behind Jefferson Avenue Diner. The owner filed 3 complaints this month. The defendant continued to return and refused to leave when police arrived at approximately 11:45 p.m. What he didn't say was that Sam never begged, never harassed anyone. He simply sat near the kitchen vent to keep warm, on nights when temperatures fell below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. A young cook would quietly leave him half a loaf of bread. Always the same, no words exchanged. But none of that here counted as mitigating circumstances. No one in that courtroom knew that the hunched man in the defendant's seat, with windburned skin and a faded military coat, was once a U.S. Marine Corps sergeant, a man who had charged into enemy fire to pull comrades out of the blast zone. His name was Samuel Sam Hawkins, 70 years old, a soldier who survived 2 wars and quietly vanished into everyday life. As if his glory had been swept away with the dust on the streets he now slept beside. In the case file, he was briefly listed as individual causing a disturbance near bus stop 12 at 11:43 p.m., but what the file didn't say was why he was there. That night, the temperature had dropped to 26 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind sharp enough to cut through skin. Sam was simply trying to warm his back over a steam grate. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just trying to survive the way the battlefield had once taught him. Survive, no matter the cost. Every wrinkle on his face was a memory no one had ever asked about. Memories of Fallujah, Kandahar, Mosul, places where he was the last man wrapping a compress around a young private's gunshot wound, where he quietly recorded the names of those who wouldn't make it home into a small notebook, the only thing he managed to save after an armored vehicle explosion. But in Havenbrook, none of that mattered. Here, he was just an old homeless man who disobeyed a police order. When officers asked him to leave, he had simply said, "Just 5 more minutes to finish this half sandwich. A cafe worker nearby, Jimmy, would often leave a portion for him at night. But that night, Jimmy had left early, and Sam, as always, leaned against the brick wall behind the cafe, chewing a cold sandwich with teeth that were no longer whole. By the time police arrived, he stood too slowly, spoke too little, didn't argue, didn't resist, and was handcuffed like a criminal with a half-eaten sandwich still lying at his feet. What could be more bitter than a man who once bled for his country, now being arrested on the very ground he once protected simply because he had nothing left? Sam didn't react as the prosecutor read the charges aloud. He wasn't angry. He was silent, because inside his rage had long since turned to stone. The only thing left was dignity and memory, and that was something no one in that room, at least not yet, had recognized. Judge Delilah Monroe sat upright on the bench, her gaze icy as it skimmed over the file before her. The defendant's name was printed clearly on the cover: Samuel Hawkins, 70 years old. Charges: disorderly conduct, third offense. She removed her glasses, fingers resting lightly on the folder's corner, an unconscious habit. But this time, something made her hand stop. Samuel Hawkins, she repeated slowly, as if tasting a name from long ago. It sounded oddly familiar. She flipped further into the file. U.S. Marine Corps, Staff Sergeant, deployment Al-Qaeda, Iraq, 2005. A chill crept down her spine. Al-Qaeda, 2005. That was where her brother, Lieutenant Matthew Monroe, had been wounded in a deadly ambush. She remembered that night clearly. The dusty uniformed soldier standing at her doorstep, handing her a crumpled letter and Matthew's final medal. They said her brother hadn't made it, but that he had survived long enough to be pulled from enemy fire. Thanks to a sergeant who had risked his own life, the man's identity had never been revealed. Delilah swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the page. Staff Sergeant Samuel Hawkins, U.S. Marine Corps, awarded the Silver Star for heroic actions in Al-Qaeda. Her hand trembled slightly. She glanced at the defendant, the man with hunched shoulders and a jacket tore at the seams. Beneath the silver beard and sun-darkened skin was a face weathered by time, but those eyes, that gaze, held the same unshakable resolve she had seen once in an old photograph of her brother. The eyes of a soldier returned from war. Delilah leaned toward her assistant and whispered, "Pull his full military record immediately." Meanwhile, Sam sat in silence, unaware that the truth about him had just taken a turn no one could have predicted. He looked up when his name was called. "Mr. Hawkins?" The judge said, this time more gently, as if something unspoken had crept into her tone. "Did you serve in Al-Qaeda in 2005? "Yes, Your Honor," Sam replied, voice hoarse but firm. "What unit?" "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. We were escorting a supply convoy when we got ambushed west of the city." Delilah gripped the armrest of her chair, her chest heavy. Every word he spoke mirrored the contents of that final letter Matthew had sent home, a letter she had kept tucked in her drawer for 20 years. Something had been stirred awake, not just memory, but truth. The truth about the man sitting before her, not a public nuisance, but a forgotten hero. And Delilah Monroe knew, from that moment forward, this trial would not be the same. The air in the courtroom turned dense as Judge Delilah Monroe scanned the file on Samuel Sam Hawkins. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened and a sharply dressed man in a dark suit entered. He walked straight to the defense table, set down a leather briefcase, and looked directly at Judge Monroe. "Your Honor, I'm Julian Wells, legal representative for Mr. Hawkins," he said in a deep, steady voice. Sam stared at him, surprised. He didn't recall hiring an attorney, and certainly couldn't afford one like this. "Mr. Hawkins," Julian leaned in, speaking gently. "A mutual friend asked me to step in. We'll talk more later." Judge Monroe nodded, signaling him to proceed. "Your Honor," Julian began. Mr. Hawkins had no intention of causing a public disturbance. He was simply trying to find warmth during a brutal winter night. More importantly, this man is a military veteran who devoted his life in service to this country. Delilah felt her heart tighten. Memories of her brother, Lieutenant Matthew Monroe, surged back like a wave. She remembered his final letter vividly, describing the soldier who had saved his life during a ferocious battle. That soldier was Sam Hawkins. Julian continued, "We respectfully ask the court to consider Mr. Hawkins' exceptional circumstances and seek leniency in sentencing." Before Judge Monroe could respond, a man stood up from the back of Courtroom. He wore an old military uniform, decorated with badges and gleaming medals. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "my name is retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Bennett. I have important information concerning Mr. Hawkins." Delilah gestured for him to proceed. "During my time in service, I had the honor of fighting alongside Mr. Hawkins. He wasn't just a brave soldier. He saved the lives of multiple comrades, myself included. The fact that he's living in such conditions today is an injustice." The courtroom fell completely silent. All eyes turned toward Sam, who sat with his head bowed, avoiding everyone's gaze. Delilah felt a powerful surge rise within her, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and duty. She knew she had to do something to correct the system's failure, the one that had let men like Sam fall through cracks. "We will recess for 15 minutes, she declared. "Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Wells, please step into the consultation room to continue this discussion." As the courtroom emptied, Delilah remained seated. Her eyes stared into nothing, her mind tangled in memories of the past and the responsibilities of the present. The atmosphere inside the courtroom thickened like fog. No one spoke. No one dared move. Every gaze was fixed on the elderly man standing at the witness stand, Samuel Hawkins, 70 years old. His hands trembled against the edge of the wooden table, his back slightly hunched. But his eyes, they no longer looked tired. They lit up not with pride, but with memory. Julian Wells turned to him slowly. "Sam, if you're up for it, tell us what happened in Alcott here in 2005. Sam drew in a deep breath. The fluorescent lights above reflected in eyes that had seen too much, more than anyone should. "It was a morning in November," he began, voice gravelly but clear. "We were on patrol in the southern outskirts. Lieutenant Monroe was leading the squad, 8 men in total. Judge Delilah Monroe lowered her head slightly, her hand clenched tight beneath the bench. That name, Monroe, was no longer just a coincidence. It was her brother, the one who never came home." Sam continued, "We were ambushed. An IED went off just 20 feet ahead. One of the Humvees flipped on its side. Smoke everywhere. Gunfire came from every direction, like a storm of bullets." He paused, as if aligning the images in his mind, each one sharp and brutal. "The lieutenant was hit. Shrapnel to the leg. He fell in the open intersection. The unit was forced to pull back." Sam lifted his eyes. His gaze cut through the silence, as if he were still there in that haze of smoke and sand. "No one dared go back. But I couldn't leave him to die in the middle of that road." A sharp inhale echoed from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. The silver-haired man in the veteran's jacket stood abruptly, but Sam didn't stop. "I crawled back to the gunfire," he said, pulled the lieutenant behind a burning fuel drum. "I wrapped his leg with my own scarf. Then I carried him over my shoulder out of kill zone." He paused, the memory thick in his throat. "I remember," he kept whispering, "don't come back for me, help the others." But I didn't listen. I promised my mother, if I could save one, I'd save them all. His voice cracked. "We lost 3 that day, but we saved 5. And Lieutenant Monroe, he lived for 3 more weeks. Long enough to call home, long enough to say goodbye." The room fell into silence. Not the cold, distant kind from earlier, but the kind born of understanding, gratitude, and a quiet ache. Judge Delilah Monroe, always the stoic face of the bench, now had tears shimmering in her eyes. She gave the faintest nod, not to anyone else, but to herself, a silent recognition. Samuel Hawkins clutched the brim of his old cap in both hands. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to know, if I had the chance to go back, would I do it again?" He paused, then softly smiled. "The answer is yes, every time." The courtroom still held the echo of his words. as if the battlefield of Al-Qadir had reappeared within these cold walls. The gunfire, the choking dust, the ragged breath of young soldiers, all of it returned through the slow, trembling cadence of a man who had survived to tell it. Sam sat quietly, his gaze slipping into a corner of memory no one else in that room could reach. But they felt it. Somehow, everyone in that courtroom could feel it. This man who entered in handcuffs this morning was not the disturber of the peace described in the charges. He was a living witness to a kind of honor the world had long forgotten. Then, suddenly, from the last row of the gallery, a silver-haired man rose to his feet. "Permission to speak, Your Honor," he said, his voice strong, but never boastful. Judge Monroe glanced at the court officer. No one stopped him. She gave a quiet nod. The man placed his hand over his chest and slowly removed a Weather Marine insignia from his blazer. "My name is Walter Green, retired captain, United States Marine Corps. And I was there that day, that battle. I was one of the men Sergeant Hawkins saved." A ripple of breath moved through the courtroom. Julian Wells leaned in and murmured, "This changes everything." Walter continued, his eyes glistening. "I was young, panicked, badly wounded. It was him, Hawkins, who crawled through the bullets, dragged me and 4 others to safety. No one ordered him to do it. No one expected it. But he did. And because of that, I'm alive to stand here today." No one spoke. Even the prosecutor's detached demeanor had melted away. One by one, people began to rise. First a few older men, then a woman wearing a military family pin, then a young cadet in a military academy uniform. They stood quietly, as if to say, "We see you now, Mr. Hawkins." Judge Delilah Monroe remained seated, but her hands, they had left the cold wooden gavel, and now rested gently on the desk. On the open case file before her, a file that no longer seemed so heavy. In a single moment, the courtroom, normally a place of judgment and sentencing, had become a place of recognition and restored dignity. No one needed to say anything more. The bowed heads of those standing, the respectful gaze from stranger to stranger, it was enough. And Samuel Hawkins, sitting at the center of that room, lifted his head high for the first time in years. The story of Sam Hawkins began to unfold, layer by layer, stirring something deep in every soul present. A soldier who once risked everything for his country was now being hauled into court, not for violence, not for crime, but for the simple act of trying to survive a freezing winter night. This was no longer just a story about a man. It was a mirror held up to society, asking a painful question. Are we doing enough for those who once risked everything for us? The answer, perhaps, lives in how we treat people like Sam Hawkins. Courtroom 3 was silent. Only the faint scratch of fountain pen across paper and the ticking of the wall clock remained. And then Judge Delilah Monroe set down her pen, took a deep breath, and stood. Without a word, she stepped down from the bench and walked into the chambers behind. A rare move in any court proceeding. Minutes later, the door opened again. Delilah returned, but she wasn't alone. 3 individuals in military dress followed her. A Marine Corps colonel, a senior staff sergeant, and a young private carrying a polished wooden box. Whatever it held, it carried a weight that froze the entire room with reverent anticipation. All eyes turned toward them. "Before we proceed," Delilah said, her voice steady, "I must conduct a special order of business." Her tone was no longer that of a judge, but that of a sister. She looked directly at Sam Hawkins, the man who had sat silently all morning, never protesting, never asking for sympathy. "Did you serve in Al-Qadir, Iraq, in 2005 with the 2nd Marine Battalion?" she asked, her eyes beginning to glisten. Sam nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "And during an ambush in the outskirts of that city, did you rescue a young lieutenant, seriously wounded, pull him from enemy fire while sustaining injuries to your own shoulder?" The room fell completely still. Delilah's voice wavered slightly. "That lieutenant was my brother." A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom, not just because the story had now been confirmed, but because of how it was told. Without fanfare, without ego, Just raw truth and unwavering loyalty. Then the Marine colonel stepped forward, his voice firm and ceremonial. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to read an official order from the United States Marine Corps Command." He opened the wooden box. Inside was a gleaming military decoration, the Navy Cross, the second highest honor awarded for valor in combat, second only to the Medal of Honor, for extraordinary heroism and self-sacrifice in the defense of fellow Marines. The colonel declared, "I hereby present, posthumously awarded and now officially bestowed, Staff Sergeant Samuel J. Hawkins, United States Marine Corps, recipient of the Navy Cross." The entire courtroom rose to their feet. No one commanded it. No one needed to speak. Some veterans raised their hands in salute. Others placed palms over their hearts. And then, in an unscripted moment that felt sacred, a white teenage boy sitting near the back spoke up, his voice soft but clear. "He used to sleep behind my family's diner. Now I know why." The words were barely above a whisper, but they rippled through the room like a tremor of truth. Sam stood up slowly, hands trembling as he received the medal from the colonel. There was no pride, no boastfulness, only the quiet bearing of a man finally being seen for who he truly was. Delilah stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "We owe you, not just for the lives you saved, but for the years society forgot you. That ends today." Judge Delilah Monroe remained still after the Marine colonel presented the Navy Cross to Sam. The entire courtroom was silent, not from shock, but from reverence. Sam Hawkins remained standing, hands shaking as he cradled the medal, as if holding the last fragments of a life lived in service. The medal shimmered not because of polished metal, but because of the way every eye in the room saw him now. Citizens, soldiers, the court clerk, even the prosecutor. The first to rise was Angeline Gwynn. She stepped from behind the clerk's desk, placed her hand over her heart with solemn respect, as if saluting the flag. Next, a man in a gray suit, David Lynn, reporter for the Havenbrook Herald, stood and removed his hat in a low bow. Then came the others, one by one, without a word. They rose. Veterans quietly raised their hands to their brows in formal military salute. Even the young prosecutor stood, his once stern face softened by a visible, indescribable emotion. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, bowed his head, and spoke aloud, "Mr. Hawkins, I apologize." Sam simply nodded. No anger, no pride, just calm, the kind carried only by those who walked through fire, death, and oblivion. Then Judge Monroe spoke, her voice no longer that of a mere arbiter of law, but that of a woman, a sister, speaking on behalf of an entire family. In light of the fact presented today and the undeniable honor demonstrated, she looked directly into Sam's eyes. The Havenbrook Court hereby dismisses all charges against Mr. Samuel Hawkins. No record, no conviction. Only one thing remains on the books. You are a hero. She raised her gavel and brought it down gently, but the room had already erupted in applause. Not thunderous, but deep, like flags flapping the wind at a military base, like the voice of a people who had, for too long, said nothing, now finally speaking. Sam turned to look at Delilah. They didn't exchange a word, but in their eyes, between the man who saved her brother and the woman who once held the gavel, everything was said. Courtroom 3 that morning hadn't just ruled on a case. It had witnessed a homecoming, not of body, but of honor, 2 weeks after the historic trial. Samuel Sam Hawkins stood before the mirror in his new apartment at the Veterans Housing Complex on the outskirts of Havenbrook. The room was modest but warm, bathed in soft morning light, filtering through curtains. It lit up the wall where his commendation and newly awarded Navy Cross now hung. Next to them were carefully restored service mementos, each one cleaned, framed, and arranged with care by Julian Wells. Sam adjusted the collar of his shirt slowly, feeling the unfamiliar softness of clean fabric, a sensation he hadn't known in years of sleeping under open skies. He still wasn't used to having a roof over his head, a soft bed, or warm meals each day. Every morning, he had to remind himself this wasn't a dream. A gentle knock at the door. Sam opened it to find Judge Delilah Monroe standing there, not in her robes, but in simple civilian clothes. She smiled warmly, holding a small box in her hands. "Good morning, Sam," she said. "I brought you something." He invited her in, and they sat together at the small table in the living room. Delilah opened the box, revealing a bundle of old letters tied with a ribbon. "These are the letters my brother Matthew wrote home from the war," she said softly. "He mentioned you often, especially in the final letter, the one describing how Sam had pulled him from enemy fire." Sam gently picked up one of the letters, his eyes catching the familiar handwriting of Matthew Monroe. Line by line, the memories of Fallujah came rushing back. The firefight, the rescue, the brotherhood. "You know," Delilah said, her voice thick with emotion, "Matthew always saw you as a hero. You gave our family more time with him, and that's something we'll never be able to repay." Sam said nothing. He was overwhelmed. He had never imagined that his actions would mean so much. After all the years of being forgotten, he now felt seen, recognized, and genuinely thanked. Delilah stood, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You gave so much to this country. Now it's our turn to give something back." Sam lowered his head slightly, as if to avoid the weight of her gratitude. "I used to think pulling him out of that fire was just instinct, but now I realize sometimes the right action at the right moment can live on in someone's heart forever." Delilah smiled, and not just in Matthew's heart, but in the hearts of the hundreds of people who stood in that courtroom. "You didn't just save one life, Sam. You reawakened a conscience." Outside, the breeze gently rustled the oak trees lining the walkway. Sam rose, stepping toward the wall where his restored medals now hung. He gazed at the Navy Cross, his eyes no longer heavy but brighter, as if, finally, he could see himself clearly again. "Memory is the one thing they can't take from you," Sam whispered. "But honor, sometimes you have to take it back." In that moment, he was no longer a forgotten homeless veteran, but a hero remembered, honored, and seen. Delilah stepped forward, standing beside him. "Today," she said softly, "I think we kept a promise." Sam nodded, slowly but firmly. And in that humble room, without ceremony, without fanfare, an old soldier reclaimed something sacred, recognition, not for the battles won, but for the character that never wavered. And just as Matthew once wrote, "No one gets left behind." Today that promise, at last, was fulfilled.